War is often told through the voices of generals, through maps, through victories, through the names of men. But this story begins somewhere else. It begins in kitchens without food, in rooms without heat, in silence that followed a child's final breath. Before the world remembered heroes, there were mothers. They did not carry weapons. They carried children. They carried loss. They carried love into places where love was never meant to survive. This is not a story of war. This is a story of the women who lived through it. Mothers in war. Winter did not arrive in Leningrad with snow. It arrived with silence. No sirens, no gunfire. Only the quiet understanding that the city had been cut off from the world. When the siege began, roads disappeared. Supply lines vanished. Hope became a rumor people were afraid to repeat. More than 2 million people were trapped inside the city, and among them were the mothers. They did not carry rifles. They did not stand in trenches. But they understood first what this war would be. It would not kill quickly. It would let them starve slowly, together with their children. Each week, the bread rations were reduced, then each day, until finally, an adult received only 125 grams. It was not real bread. It was made from sawdust, from husks, from anything that could be pressed into a shape and called food. Mothers stood in line before dawn, wrapped in thin coats, feet frozen to the ground. They didn't stand for themselves. They stood for their children. Some carried ration cards belonging to children who had already died, hidden inside their sleeves, not to cheat, only to bring home one more bite for a child still breathing. At home, mothers broke their bread in half, not out of heroism, but because if a child ate alone, guilt would follow, and guilt killed faster than hunger. The temperature fell below -30 degrees Celsius. There was no electricity, no heating, no running water. Mothers burned whatever they could find: furniture, doors, books. Some burned their children's school books, not because knowledge no longer mattered, but because survival mattered more. At night, mothers slept holding their children, not to keep them warm, but to check if they were still breathing. In the mornings, many were afraid to wake them, because if there was no response, they would have to face that truth alone. There were whispers in the city, words never spoken aloud. Cannibalism. Not monsters committed it. Mothers did. Mothers who had been pushed beyond every human limit. Some chose not to eat so their children could live. Others ate so they would have strength to work and earn more rations. There were no correct choices in Leningrad, only choices made in absolute despair. Children died before their mothers. There were no coffins, no funerals. Small bodies were pulled through the streets on sleds. Silent. Light, as if they had never existed. Most mothers did not cry, not because they felt nothing, but because their bodies no longer had the strength to produce tears. They wrote their children's names in small notebooks, a line, a date, an hour, and then they continued living, living to remember, living to bear witness, living so their children would not disappear without meaning. Despite everything, Leningrad did not surrender. Mothers went to factories while starving. They sewed uniforms with trembling hands. They built weapons while barely standing. They carried bricks. They dug trenches. They worked because stopping meant death. Sometimes a mother collapsed at her machine and never stood up again. Her co-workers covered her body and kept working, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Music still played in the city. During the siege, an orchestra performed a symphony. Starving musicians held their instruments with fingers that no longer felt warm. Mothers listened through open windows. They cried, not because the music was beautiful, but because it reminded them that they were still human. When the siege finally ended, the city was alive, but its mothers were changed forever. Many returned home alone, to empty rooms, to beds that would never be slept in again. They did not speak much about what they had done to survive. They did not ask for praise. They carried the war inside them until the end of their lives. Leningrad survived because of its soldiers, but it endured because of its mothers. Mothers who starved so their children could eat. Mothers who buried their children and kept living. Mothers who proved that even in the darkest hunger, love could still refuse to die. Hunger does not scream, it whispers. At first, it whispers gently. A dizziness, a trembling hand, a child who sleeps a little longer than usual. Then it begins to speak more clearly. The city changed its sounds. Children stopped crying, not because they were comforted, but because their bodies no longer had the strength. Mothers learned to measure life by breath. 1, 2. Pause. If the pause lasted too long, they already knew. Some mothers kept their children alive by telling stories, not fairy tales, memories. They spoke of summers by the river, of apples, of warm bread. They described tastes their children could no longer remember. It was a form of feeding, words instead of food. Many mothers stopped menstruating. Their bodies shut down anything unnecessary for survival. Hair fell out, teeth loosened. Still, they stood in ration lines. Still, they brought home crumbs wrapped like treasure. When a child died, neighbors helped. Silently. The body was wrapped in cloth. If there was strength, the mother pulled the sled herself. If not, she asked a stranger. The streets were filled with sled tracks, each one a farewell. Graves were shallow. The ground was frozen. Sometimes bodies were stacked, unnamed, waiting for spring. Mothers memorized locations. Near the broken fence, under the third tree, by the factory wall. They repeated them in their minds, because forgetting felt like betrayal. One woman wrote in her diary, "I became a mother twice, once when I gave birth, and once when I buried my child." There were rumors the authorities tried to silence, stories that could not be printed, stories that could not be spoken, only whispered. Children disappearing, entire families vanishing overnight. The truth was unbearable. Some mothers reached a point where love and madness touched. When a child died of hunger, there were mothers who did not report it. Not immediately. They kept the body, wrapped it carefully. They told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves it was survival. This is where history becomes uncomfortable. This is where judgment must stop, because no one who has never starved has the right to speak loudly here. There were arrests, there were executions, but punishment could not erase hunger. It only added fear. Other mothers chose a different horror. They sent their children away across the frozen Lake Ladoga, the road of life. Trucks crossed ice that cracked and screamed beneath their weight. Some broke through. Some children never arrived. Mothers stood on the shore and watched the trucks disappear, not knowing if they had saved their child or killed them. Either way, they would never see them again. That was the cruel arithmetic of Leningrad. Stay and die together. Leave and die alone. There came a point when grief became heavy, too heavy. Some mothers stopped reacting. They watched death as if from a distance, their faces empty, their eyes dry. This frightened others more than screaming ever could, because it meant the soul had begun to retreat. Doctors wrote reports about emotional exhaustion, but this was not illness. It was armor, a necessary numbness. Women walked past bodies in the street, not because they were heartless, but because stopping would mean joining them. Mothers learned how to step over the dead without looking down. They hated themselves for it. At night, guilt returned. It sat beside them in the darkness, whispered names, asked questions with no answers. Some children lived, thin as shadows, silent as ghosts. They learned early not to ask for food. They learned to chew slowly, as if making time last longer. Many never grew properly. Their bodies carried the siege forever. Even decades later, survivors said, "I'm still hungry." Mothers watched these children grow. Every scar on their bodies felt like an accusation. They fed them first, even after the siege. Even when food returned, they could not stop, because hunger had taught them fear that never left. When the blockade was lifted, the city celebrated. Flags, speeches, music. But mothers walked home quietly. Victory felt hollow. Too many were missing. Apartments were sealed with black marks, entire staircases empty. Mothers entered rooms that still smelled of death. They opened cupboards that contained nothing. Some sat on the floor and did not move for hours. There were no words left. The government called them heroes. The city built monuments. But monuments do not replace children. Mothers carried their stories instead. Quietly, relentlessly. They told them to grandchildren, to strangers, to no one at all. And sometimes late at night, they spoke to the dead. The Siege of Leningrad lasted nearly 900 days. More than 1 million civilians died. Statistics cannot hold grief, but if the city lived, it was because its mothers refused to surrender. Not to the enemy, not to hunger, not to despair. They lost children. They lost themselves. And still, they endured. History remembers battles, but Leningrad remembers its mothers, the ones who starved silently, the ones who made impossible choices, the ones who carried love through hell. They were not saints. They were human, and that is what makes their sacrifice eternal. When the war ended, the world moved on. Cities were rebuilt. Borders were redrawn. History found new battles to remember. But for the mothers, the war never truly ended. It lived in empty rooms, in names spoken only in whispers, in the quiet moments no monument could hold. They were not remembered in textbooks, but they carried the weight of history in their hearts. If we remember them now, it is not to glorify war, but to honor the love that survived it. This was Mothers in War.